Is a cell tower going up in your neighborhood? If it's not now, it may soon. But tonight, Julie Watts asked the question you're not supposed to ask. Are there legitimate health concerns?
According to federal law, the city simply can't consider health concerns. It's outlined in this small section of the Telecommunications Act, based on science from 1996. But if cities do consider health, the cell companies can sue.
5G can be a tremendous boom, but only if it can be put up quickly. I know scientifically cell phone towers is safe.
But the International Association of Firefighters disagrees. They began opposing cell towers on fire stations after firefighters complained of health problems. Current regulations don't take into account continuous low-level exposure from these small cells 24 hours a day. So, following lobbying by firefighters, Cork and his co-author exempted fire stations from their bill, making them one place cell companies couldn't put a tower.
Do you think that maybe you should consider putting a pause on legislation that speeds up these towers until there's definitive evidence that there is no harm?
We can do a lot of studies, and there are people right now, believe it or not, who are sure the world is flat.
5G, as you well know, also uses higher frequency waves that don't travel as far and will rely on a network of hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of small cell sites. And the question then is, are there any health implications, any public safety implications to those additional sites that are likely to be located close to homes, schools, workplaces? My question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Perry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed?
There are no industry-backed studies to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
So essentially, the answer to my question, how much money? Zero.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
Anybody else know of industry commitments to back research, fund it, support it, to ascertain scientifically the health effect?
No, I'm not aware of any.
So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The benefits of our connected universe are potentially very significant. Unfortunately, there is an increasing body of evidence that suggests that the health risks are very significant as well. Any concerns about radiation exposure are routinely greeted with the words, emissions are well within FCC guidelines. The issue is that these guidelines indicate acceptable radiation levels which are orders of magnitude above what has been demonstrated as safe when non-thermal effects are considered. The FCC guidelines are clearly insufficient.
We need to start measuring how much radiation are people being exposed to before we roll out 5G. What is our exposure in a day? It's not one cell phone. It's cell phones, it's multiple wireless networks, it's smart meters, it's cell towers. It's this sandwich, and it all adds up.
You're a trained medical professional.
Yes.
We don't have one on the panel. What are we to make of the American Cancer Society, for example, telling us there's no evidence of harmful product?
That many of these organizations have conflicts of interest.
Very briefly, if you can, what do you mean by conflict of interest?
One of the first things that you teach residents is that you always have to look at the funding.
Welcome, everybody, to the White House. This is White House 5G Summit. Really happy to be joined by a lot of leaders in industry, members of Congress and the Senate, White House leaders on this, and people from the FCC. Before we start, one, we are government, so don't assume we know anything.
I have become accustomed to giving speeches in my new position on subjects about which I frankly know very little, and we need more cell towers and connections in Connecticut, my home state. It's ridiculous.
The U.S. is in the lead thanks to our private sector as well as the work of the FCC and this administration overall. But China and South Korea and many other countries are eager to claim this mantle.
We have every intention to deploy 5G first and reap the benefits of faster and more robust wireless.
Our strategy is called the 5G FAST Plan, a plan to facilitate America's superiority in 5G technology.
Industry is not asking the government for money to build 5G networks. They're asking us to cut the red tape that surrounds infrastructure deployment.
We cannot let today's red tape strangle the 5G future.
The red tape slows and sometimes stops the building of densified network facilities necessary for 5G.
As we continue our efforts to keep government out of the way so that America can continue its leadership for America to win the race to 5G.
We're not here to be completely heavy-handed, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And some of these states or cities that don't want to cooperate want to shake us down. We can't allow obstacles and barriers to stop this movement. That's all.
It's a fact that most insurance companies will not indemnify against EMF effects. Telecom companies around the world are warning their investors of potential major costs due to real risks of EMF pollution from their products. Interestingly enough, they're warning their investors, but they're not telling their customers. They're basically keeping it quiet because that's where their money comes from. So we're using technology that could be very potentially harmful to us, and the investors know it. But their only worry is that they might lose money, not that our health might be affected.
First of all, I think what you should really think about is why is it that they're not insured? It's not that they chose to be self-insured. They actually rejected by the insurance company from being insured because they understand the risk. And
so the insurance companies, the big insurance companies, will not insure the telecommunications?
So there's insurance companies, and then there's what's called secondary insurance companies. Secondary insurance companies are the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. So in an event, an insurance company, let's say I insure Verizon, and it may not be able to meet the claims, then the secondary insurance company is kicking in.
Like Lloyd's of London.
Sorry?
Like
yes,
Lloyd's of
exactly.
London.
So two leading one would be Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re. Both told the insurance company not to insure the wireless industry, and this is why they're not insured. Because in 1993, the FCC started a rulemaking to adopt the IEEE regulations on this issue. IEEE is an engineer association. Why is it that we adopt regulation of engineers who maybe know how to measure this radiation when it's passing a wall, but not when it's passing a body?
And remember that denial of request or denial permit request that you can put in? It's going to point back to the acceptable levels as determined by the FCC, not the EPA or not the CDC, the ones who usually take care of health concerns, but by the FCC, which is staffed by former members of the telecommunication industry. They are effectively indemnified against adverse health impact lawsuits when the acceptable limits are higher than the limits actually shown to show harmful health effects. That's a fox guarding the henhouse.
There is no environmental oversight for such effects to non-human species. FCC exposure standards do not include wildlife. They are strictly for short-term acute exposures to humans, not the long-term chronic low-level exposures that are common today. The FCC has been described by Harvard University's Center for Ethics writer Norman Alster as the most captured agency in DC, acting more as a industry cheerleader than a regulator.
For example, the previous chairman of the FCC is Tom Wheeler. He was the head of the Wireless Lobby Association for 14 years. Now remember, Obama told us there would be no lobbyists in his administration, so he took the biggest lobby and put him as a head of the FCC.
Yes, 5G will connect the Internet of everything. If something can be connected, it will be connected in the 5G world. Hundreds of billions of microchips connected in products from pill bottles to plant waterers, requiring massive deployment of small cells. We won't wait for the standards. The 5G revolution will touch all corners, and that's damn important.
How do you respond to those communities around the country who are fighting based on property rights or just different pushback? What's the FCC position on that?
We're very excited about the build out of 5G and next-gen internet infrastructure. And at the FCC, we've been really building on a lot of the policies that state and local leaders have been putting in place to make sure that every single community can benefit. It's really a great job story. It's a great story for economic growth. So we're really happy with the progress that we're seeing in building out 5G, both here in Houston and a lot of other communities around the country.
What about those who have concerns, say for example, Harvard put out the study about captured agency, that folks like yourself who've been lawyers and worked in the industry are essentially captured the regulators.
Yeah, we're really glad to see the growth in 5G. And one of the things that we've done at the FCC is build on the policies put in place by local elected leaders here in Houston. Texas, the state legislature put policies in place that help guide the way for 5G builds. So we're really excited with the progress that we're seeing.
No comment on the conflict of interest concerns?
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
I moved to California, Southern California. The 60 hertz work that we did was supported by a contract from the Department of Energy. The radio frequency radiation work that we did was supported by Motorola. The relationship was really very cordial and very stress-free, but only up until we started generating data. These folks were very, very upset and began to talk about how are they going to handle this, what sort of spin can we put on this, what can we expect from this, and from that point on the relationship changed. What we saw was that Motorola began to exert more and more control over the work, telling us what to do, telling us how to write abstracts, what to say in the abstracts, what to say in the papers. I had completed our study of DNA damage, and I submitted the final report to Motorola, and I got a call from Mays Swycord at Motorola. Now, Mays is the former head of the, CDRH, Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA, and he left the FDA and went to work for Motorola. Keep that connection in mind. Anyhow, Mays didn't like the work. They simply weren't willing to accept my interpretation of my study, my evaluation of my study, my knowledge of science, and tried to urge me not to publish the study, and they wanted me to do more work. I stopped taking calls from them, and I went ahead and published the study.
From your perspective, you feel that there was a legitimate amount of time to evaluate the data that the opposition would have on this?
Absolutely, and I wouldn't put forth something that I didn't believe in. And I'll tell you, as I mentioned earlier, and it's been commented several times amongst the panel here, this is truly an economic development issue. Our 3-year-old, again at home, is outraged when we pull out the driveway and he's not able to access Wi-Fi.
SAR stands for specific absorption rate, and that's the measure of how much radio waves, or how much RF energy, in this case radio waves, is absorbed into the human body over a certain period of time within a certain volume. So it's a measure of the heating effect that a radio transmitter would have on your body, on the human body.
The SAR for every mobile phone is measured in this way, using an artificial head called a SAM Phantom. This is filled with a glucose mixture which represents the brain. The probe measures the amount of microwave radiation that penetrates the SAM Phantom skull and calculates a SAR rating based on how much energy is absorbed.
The SAM head is an average shaped and sized human skull. The average of 10,000 people has been taken in terms of their head measurements, and this SAM Phantom head has been created, which is an average human skull.
But when we investigate the company that makes the SAM Phantom head, we discover that the news is even worse. The SAM Phantom isn't just the average of 10,000 people. It's the average of 10,000 US Army personnel.
You need to understand where SAR came from. I was there when SAR was invented. Richard Phillips, Don Justison, Sal Michelson, Herman Schwann. These were men who created the SAR, whose mind gave rise to it. And the reason they did was because they were interested in developing microwave ovens and in understanding how to cook meat. And it's useful for understanding how to cook meat, but it has no application whatsoever that I have ever seen suggested or advanced for understanding mobile phones. It works for dead muscle. It has just no applicability, in my opinion, to live brain. Because the health risks associated with mobile phone fields have nothing to do with heat. So it makes no sense to say, I have a really great way of measuring heat when the measurement of heat is irrelevant.
Motorola didn't want to be proven wrong that they were testing their devices with a defective head-shaped model. And I mentioned that, but I think there's the liability issues involved here, that they had been releasing products into the market, testing it wrongly. That's where the mistake occurred, that the cartilage is non-absorptive, but real living cartilage has blood flow in it. So the tissue properties of a living cartilage is similar to that of the face. It is not a plastic.
So for everyone listening, Sam doesn't have skin. And that's our biggest organ and one of the most important, especially for sweat glands and conducting electricity, which...
Correct, wet gland is the proper word, yes.
So they literally used a dummy test, which is a negligent test, to proliferate the market with devices that do not even pass a biological test. And what's so scary is that because we are bioresonant beings and we resonate with our environments, like we're literally going to be in an unprecedented amount of electrosmog that is going to interfere with our connection to nature.
It will radiate only as much as is needed to maintain communication. But as you get further away from the central city into the suburbs where the base stations are fewer and fewer, then the device is allowed to radiate more and more power.
Well, this is something that most people don't know, is that a weak signal requires far more radiation. And it's generally thought of that if you've got a weak signal that you're off grid, or that's a good thing. But a weak signal is a lot more dangerous, which is something most people don't know.
You may have heard that because 5G only gets 1/64 inch or a few millimeters into the skin, it can have no biological effect. Well, whoever has told you that doesn't understand basic biology. The skin-associated lymphoid tissue is critically important to the immune system. As an example of the ability of the skin to resonate with 5G, the sweat ducts resonate like small helical antennas to absorb and reflect that radiation. Thinner skin will absorb more, thicker skin will absorb less, and this work has been published in peer-reviewed journals showing that the skin does have a biological response to millimeter wave technology.
This is an OCT image of living human skin. OCT is optical coherence tomography. Basically, it's a method of imaging the skin as skin. And those coils that you see quite clearly there are your sweat ducts. We have 2 to 5 million of these on our skin. This is relevant when we start looking at frequencies. Is there a health implication? And that's the big question. If I have something, and I'll just go back one stage. If I have something which to a radio engineer looks just like a coiled antenna, similar to what you would take out of your radio, would it work like an antenna? We happen to have a very high-end vector network analyzer which could send a signal anything from 75 gig all the way up to 110 gig onto the skin of a person and read what comes back. It's a simple experiment, if you put it that way. So what we did, we made a nice little protocol. We measured the hands of people while they sat there calmly. Then we made them run around this particular campus 2 or 3 times, dried their hands so we wouldn't have any problem, and measured the hand again, and looked at what we could see. What we could see resulted in this particular article published in 2008, where we basically stated that these things could work like helical antennas. That the sweat duct was an integral part of the mechanism for the absorption of energy, and that if you changed the character of the sweat duct, i.e. made it work, you could actually change that absorption in some way. So pretty clearly, there is a mechanism, and it's quite nice, that at least in that particular frequency level, the skin is absorbing, and the main, if you like, motivator of that absorption would be the sweat duct. And this is all before we'd even realized that these industry standards were going to come out for 5G. We're not the only people. There's been a few other groups as well who've also looked at it. In fact, using Esra's software, Gal Schafferstein also came to the same conclusion, and he went one stage further than us. He actually looked at SAR rates as well. Now, he did this because the American Army had commissioned him to explain why their 94 gigahertz crowd dispersal gun made people run away when the beam touched them. And finally, there's a very nice guy in Queen Mary University, Akim he's called, who's looking at how we can use the skin as a transport layer, send signals through the skin to communicate with devices on our bodies. And he also finds the same thing, that the sweat ducts are very, very important in how that signal will be sent through the skin layer itself. It's really water, which is probably the most indicative part of what will absorb all that information. We've got sweat ducts filled with water, and quite simply, because it layers itself very nicely, you can get protons jumping between water molecules along those particular structures that they have. So if there's a possibility of absorbing the wavelengths inside the sweat ducts, they can be antennas. If they can be antennas, you have to accept what they are. We showed this to industry in, Professor Feldman showed this to industry in 2014, was it, in the BioWireless? 2015, the BioWireless conference. We cannot say they were happy. That would be an understatement. And I think it's safe to say they'll sweep this one under the carpet as far as they possibly can. No.
But what's the big deal? It's just affecting your sweat, right? Why should we be concerned about this as a health issue?
We don't know how it affects us, to be perfectly frank. We know that we get absorption. If the US Army could use it to scare away people, that's already a bad sign in my particular books. And this is just considering a thermal effect. If we're really honest, there could be effects which are far, far, far insidious.
Right. Watch what happens when I plug it in. It becomes a transmitter for electric. Right, and look how far it transmits, look. So if you're laying in bed with that next to your head, that is all going into your head.
What is it, signals?
That's electric.
Electric.
Come off there, yeah. And if you're on the phone...
Yeah, let me do it.
Touch mine in there. Watch what happens when I pick my phone up when it's charging. So that is going right into your body now, all that electric is not just going into the phone.
I'm going to talk about environmental radiation, electromagnetic radiation, and how it modulates the symptoms of immune disease. What we found about a decade ago was that to persist inside cells, the microbiome has to disable key gene translation for cell-mediated immunity. In a paper, Quantum Criticality at the Origin of Life, where he basically showed that by their very nature, biological proteins tend to all be at a critical state, ready to be easily changed from one state to another, or one shape, one conformation to another, by non-ionizing energy, such as in electromagnetic waves. I came up with a hat, a cap. We call it a sleeping cap. Goes over the head, covers the brain stem. It's made of a special silver fabric, silver mesh fabric, with bamboo as well to make it more comfortable. And in particular, it covers this critical area, the deep cervical lymph nodes. And what we found was amazing. 90% of the cohort reported definite or strong effects. The strange thing was that many of the effects were negative. They were bad. Why would somebody feel worse, or when you shield their brains from electrosmog, electromagnetic radiation, why would someone feel worse? You remember back on the first slides I said that our whole therapeutic approach has been immunostimulation. The characteristic of immunostimulation is that the symptoms get worse before they get better. Here is the ANA titer for a rheumatoid arthritic patient. The ANA titer doubled in the first year of therapy, and then after 3 years fell down to baseline where it stayed. Over here we have ankylosing spondylitis patient. Once again, the symptoms got worse through the first 2.5 years before they finally tapered away. In other words, what was happening here is that the waves were, shielding the brains from the waves was reactivating the immune systems of these patients. And because these patients were very marginal in terms of symptomatic control, they lost that symptomatic control when the extra activation of the immune system occurs. The corollary of that is that there is immune suppression above a fairly low level of environmental RF. Through 97% of the German population, there is suppression of some immune components. And then the sensitivity goes down to about minus 80 dBm in actual living environments, and when they wear the extra clothing, drops them down to about 90. So we know that the brain is responding throughout this region. But the thermal noise floor, the Boltzmann thermal noise floor on the left, shows that the brain is not acting as a mass being heated. The brain is acting as a radio receiver, because otherwise it could not be sensing signals in this range.
Dr. Valco and her team studied 47 healthy people for an entire year. Participants had a cell phone placed on their left and right ears. One was activated but muted, the other was turned off. Dr. Valco used brain imaging equipment to study how much glucose the brain would use during exposure.
So it's a very sensitive marker to indicate if there are changes in brain activity that may be driven by a given stimulus, which in this case was the cell phone. 50-minute exposure to a cell phone was associated with increases in glucose consumption by the brain, which indicates that the brain was being activated by the radio frequencies from the cell phone. This right area of the brain that was very close to the antenna showed the largest increases in metabolism as compared when the telephones were off.
They metabolize glucose in place of the oxygen. So what does that mean? That means that when the brains are exposed to cell phone radiation, they are not oxygenating well. They have to utilize glucose to process cellular function. And this is as old as 2012. So wireless radiation is, in fact, a neurotoxin. It's toxic to cells. Loss of memory, cells deteriorate in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the inferior part of the temporal lobe that's responsible for our memory. Oxidative stress, I already mentioned. Demyelination. Demyelination is what happens when the lining of the nerve cells in the spinal cord and even in the brain deteriorate. It's the common occurrence that happens with multiple sclerosis.
The discovery of a new protein cell called a cryptochrome suggests all life has a magnetic sense.
They were discovered in the 1990s in plants where their function is to absorb blue light, which is used to regulate growth. They were since been found in insects, animals, mammals, including humans, and in birds.
In the year 2000, Thorsten Ritz demonstrated an even more amazing role for the cryptochrome. In a series of experiments on robins, he demonstrated that their navigational sense was not only a magnetic one, but it came directly from the cryptochrome cells, which are located behind the eye. The experiments by Ritz clearly demonstrated that the cryptochrome cell used in navigation was seriously affected by man-made frequencies.
This is not some kind of scientific blind man's buff. It's an experiment to find out whether children have a sense of direction. Blindfolded and ear-muffed, the subject is turned around in a special chair until he can't remember which direction he's facing. The chair stops and the subject guesses whether he's facing east, west, north or south. The guess is recorded in a small computer. If children had no sense of direction, their guesses would be random, but they're not. children after the age of about 10 or 11 make pretty good guesses. It seems they have a real sense of direction. And it seems to be a magnetic sense. When the scientists strap a magnet to the subject's head, it disrupts his sense of direction severely.
This presentation exposes 14 flawed assumptions and counters them with peer-reviewed scientific studies that number in the thousands. These are the 14 flawed assumptions on radio frequency limits made by the FCC and ICNIRP. Some of these assumptions are simply wrong. They're based on inadequate testing procedures. Some are ignored, and the safety factor is arbitrary. And finally, 5G is untested, yet it's assumed to be safe. These claims by the Federal Communication and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection are false. Ionizing radiation is the wrong model for non-ionizing radiation. Environmental effects, synergistic effects, and characteristics of the waveform are ignored. And finally, the safety factors designed for the public and for workers are arbitrary and do not protect against damage.
Current public exposure levels are at least 1 quintillion, that's 18 zeros, 1 quintillion times above natural background radiation, according to Professor Olle Johansson of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. The highly dangerous biological effects of EMFs have been documented by thousands of studies since 1932, indicating that we may be facing a global health catastrophe orders of magnitude worse than those caused by tobacco and cigarettes. 5G is designed to deliver concentrated and focused electromagnetic radiation in excess of 100 times current levels in the same way as do directed energy weapons. There is currently an international appeal signed by 237 EMF scientists from 41 nations, urging the UN and particularly the WHO to exert strong leadership in fostering the development of more protective EMF guidelines, encouraging precautionary measures, and educating the public about the considerable health risks, particularly the risks to children and fetal development.
Sorry, because we are talking with someone that is a little bit ignorant on these things. If you're talking to the Wi-Fi systems, I become worried because I put those devices in my house. I will have to, I confess my ignorance on this. We will have to, but I'm going to raise this with WHO, which I think is the organization that might be able to deal with it properly, because I must confess I was not aware of that danger.
In 2011, the World Health Organization changed the danger rating of mobile phones, reclassing it as possibly carcinogenic to humans, based on an increased risk of contracting a glioma, the type of brain tumor associated with using a mobile phone.
Professor Yuri Grigorev was also called in to help with the Chernobyl disaster. So he dealt with ionizing radiation as well as non-ionizing radiation. And I actually asked him a question directly and said, what is worse, ionizing radiation or non-ionizing radiation? And he said, non-ionizing radiation is worse because it is totally out of control. And he said, with ionizing radiation, we know that you've got to take protective measures now. There's only a certain amount of X-rays, we know we've got to be careful with the amount of X-rays you take. But with this, it's just layer after layer after layer of more frequencies, more radiation.
The data we're going to look at are all published science, testing results, or public standards. At the bottom end of the radiation scale of what's called power density or signal strength is the minimum level at which cell phones will work. Pine needles were found to age prematurely at 0.000027. At short-term exposures of 0.05, children aged 8 to 17 experienced headache, irritation, concentration difficulties, and behavioral problems. Point 1 is the Baubiology or Building Biology Guideline for extreme concern. 1.0 produced sperm DNA fragmentation and a decrease in sperm viability in vitro. Also at 1.0, the science shows the following bodily effects can occur. 2.5 saw altered calcium metabolism in heart muscle cells. 4.0, changes in the hippocampus affecting brain memory and learning, and at 6.0, DNA damage in cells. A single Itron smart meter with pulses up to 7.93 microwatts per centimeter squared. Even though there are all these known health effects at levels far lower, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg see fit to set the standard at 9.5. And China, Poland, and Russia, 10.0. A room of 12 smart meters, very common and even a conservative number in an apartment building, tested at 19.8 microwatts per centimeter squared. In Canada and the US and several other civilized countries, the safety limit is set at 600 to 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. This so-called safety limit is literally tens of thousands of times higher than levels which are known to damage health, according to peer-reviewed published science.
I have here an EMF meter which measures microwave radiation from cell phone towers. And I have a chart here put together by emwatch.com which shows a 7.8 falls in the light green category, the number 2. And that's pretty safe. Small risk of serious health effects. Anything over 300 is not safe. There's a high risk of serious health effects. I'm going to drive the vehicle around the corner to demonstrate something. I'm going to turn the corner right here, and I'll try to keep the camera on. As you can see, the numbers are starting to go up. 500. Okay, there's a car behind me. Let me put on my hazard. Let it pass. So right here, it's over 1,000 millivolts per meter. And let me show you why. I'll zoom in. And there's a cell phone tower on top of that restaurant.
So in our first slides, what we see is normal cells, and the structure of the cells is intact and sound. This is what we would expect from a normal sample. In our second set of tests, we're using the smart meter. Before the exposure, we see the same thing as we saw in the first samples. Normal cell walls, fairly separated and looking healthy. Sample 1, you can see a lot of degradation in the cells. The cell walls have been broken, and you see changes in the cells which are called mycoplasma. It shows a mutation to the cell. In the second sample, we see a different type of degradation to the cell membranes. You can see a corrugation here. This is called bottle cap formation, and it's known that this occurs due to oxidation or exposure to free radicals. And here you see a phenomenon called rouleau, where the red blood cells are stacking up, which makes it very difficult for the blood to deliver oxygen to the tissues as they would be their normal function.
A long time ago, you used to have smoke on airplanes. People could smoke tobacco on airplanes. And I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities. And when somebody said to me there could be a problem with this with our health, I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. If there was a problem, I'd know about it. Well, I was wrong. I'm going to ask you to help me out here. Please go to the settings on your phone. Under General, then go to About. Now you have to scroll all the way down to something you don't normally see, called Legal. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know that you cannot keep the phone directly next to your body without exceeding the as-tested exposure guidelines. But all smartphones come with some information that basically says, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines. Let's go back to almost 20 years ago when standards for cell phones were first set up. At that time, it was believed that the only thing you had to worry about was avoiding heat. That was the only effect you had to be concerned about.
And so they employed the head of a very large person, a 220-pound male, who was at the top 98th percentile of military recruits in 1989 in the United States. And they set the standards to avoid heating up that fellow's brain after a 6-minute phone call. The microwave oven actually happens to be of the same frequency as the cell phone, the mobile phone. The mobile phone and the microwave oven use a very similar frequency. The difference between them is power. The power of the microwave oven is 1,000 watts. And of course, that's power that can heat up a cup of water in maybe 60 seconds. The microwave oven, the mobile phone, the cordless phone, the Wi-Fi monitor, the baby monitor, they all use the same frequency. They differ in power. They also differ because mobile phones and Wi-Fi devices emit pulsed microwave radiation. It's the pulse, not the power, that appears to be biologically most important. This is just to show you what happens in a 4-second mobile phone call. This is power density, and of course, a phone is on standby, it's not doing too much, but 900 times a minute, it's looking for a signal. It says to the tower, where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. It's smart. That's how it's supposed to do. Now, when the phone rings, the worst time for you to put a phone right next to your head is when you answer it and say hello, because it's smart and it goes to max power. They're programmed to do that. Max power. Now, it's going to go to max power. You're going to listen, and then it will go up and down and up and down. And again, it's that variation. It's the delta. It's the cumulative integrative dose under the curve over a lifetime of exposure that looks to be biologically important. And this is a modeled microwave radiation dose of a 6-year-old with greater levels to the frontal and temporal lobes, eyes and cheek. And watch this here. Now, yellow, white, and red are the hottest, all right? And if you look carefully, you will see it's going into the eye, the nose, and partly into the brainstem. That's just showing you that there's going to be some exposure into that area of a young head. And look here at the radiation as it gets into the groin area. And that's just from having a mobile phone modeled into the pocket. Now, this is some new modeling, again, that we've developed with colleagues in Brazil, and we can share with you how we've done it. We first start out with the MRI and create the model with 1 millimeter voxels, and this is quite a bit of work goes into creating this, and here is what it looks like after a period of 6 minutes. And that's really not as bad as it might look, because you see the red area only gets partway through the eye of the adult. The one that we're really concerned about is this one with the young child. And this is a 3-year-old brain that we modeled. And you see that by the end of that 6-minute call, the peak radiation, yellow and red, is getting all the way into almost both eyes. It may not cause any biological effect whatsoever for 1 call or 2 calls or 3 calls. But the question is, what's the cumulative impact of this kind of exposure? The problem we face is that right now, we're in the midst of an experiment on my grandchildren and your children, and we don't have anybody to compare them with. We don't have a control group in science. When you are given a drug, it's usually been studied where some people get the drug and some people don't get the drug, and they're called the controls. And then you see whether or not those who got the drug are healthier than those who did not. And when you get results, you can conclude, if there is a difference between the exposed and the control group, that your drug has worked. Well, when it comes to mobile phone radiation, we've lost our ability to have a true control group. NATO may be familiar to some of you, and NATO for years has supported research on radar. Radar, of course, gave birth to the microwave oven. Okay, the first microwave oven was called a radar range. The guys figured out that they could cook things with radar, and they thought it was pretty cool. They actually discovered it because when guys would be standing on the deck and it was cold at night, they would warm themselves in front of the radar, and if they had chocolate in their pocket, it would melt. So that's how they decided to figure out what would happen if you beamed radar at things like hot dogs and corn and soon enough, that gave birth to the radar range. But women didn't like the idea of cooking with radar. Guys thought it was pretty cool. So they rekindled the name to microwave. It sounded dainty. This is the data from the Cleveland Clinic showing that men who keep cell phones in their pockets the longest have the lowest sperm count. And again, there are many other studies with similar results. So we can debate legitimately the question of brain cancer, and I would welcome an open and honest debate about that question. But when it comes to issues like this, there really is not much to debate. This is a normal testis. You see the boundaries, the cell wall. It looks very nice. And this is after microwave radiation exposure. Now, the breast. The breast is mostly fat, contains a lot of fluid. Things that contain fat and fluid cook faster in the microwave oven. Now, a cell phone can't cook anything. All right? Mobile phones do not pop popcorn. That was a fraud. They don't make any heat that we know of, otherwise they wouldn't be permitted. But they do go through things that contain fat and fluid. This was a Chinese-American woman who used her cell phone 4 hours a day in her bra for 10 years while she was driving. Now, and you drive with a phone on your body. The phone is smart. It's going to go from one tower to another, and it's going to say, here I am, where are you, here I am. And it's going to be going to max power each time it moves from one cell tower to another. And there it was right next to her chest. And the tumors that developed right under the antenna of the phone. This is an MRI of a young woman, a very brave young woman named Tiffany France. When she was 21, she's now 22. She developed metastatic breast cancer. This is metastases into her chest wall right here. And this outlined the phone. And it was subcutaneous, so it's like right under the surface of the skin. It was not deep within the breast. Most breast cancer occurs in women over 50. It occurs in the upper outer quadrant. These tumors occurred right under the antenna of the phone. So now, why is there no increase in brain cancer that we can find in the general population today? Because there is not. And after all, if mobile phones really are important, why don't we have an epidemic today? Well, let me tell you why. First of all, brain cancer takes a long time to develop. How do we know that? We know that because when the bombs fell at the end of World War II, there was no increase in brain cancer in the survivors who had been studied. No increase at all, until 40 years had passed. It took 40 years for an increase in brain cancer to show up in that highly exposed population. In 1994, when industry first became aware that there were studies suggesting that mobile phone radiation could damage brain cells of rats, a memo was written to, quote, war-game the science. In France, there's a ban on advertising to young children, under age 12, by the way. All cell phones have to be sold with earpieces. There has to be labeling of the specific absorption rate on phones, and there's got to be warnings. In India, they've lowered their tower limits to 1/10 that of the international standards, and they have official guidelines for cell phone use, using headsets and speakerphones. The Supreme Court in India has actually ordered a number of towers to be torn down. Israel has a national institute on non-ionizing radiation. They say no Wi-Fi in kindergarten. They all prefer wired over wireless in schools. All phones, again, are to come with headsets and safety. And no advertising with children. In Belgium, the law has been implemented as of 2014. It was passed in 2013. No phones are to be designed or sold for children under the age of 7. Again, all handsets must be sold with headsets, and the sale to young children is specifically prohibited. Canada has issued practical advice as well. And I don't go into any more details here. These slides will become available on the website for the university, and we have much more detailed information I can share with you from our website as well. The Canadian Parliamentary Health Committee has urged that there be a recognition that this is a, quote, serious public health issue.
I'm Paul Dard. I'm an MD. I'm a physician in Eugene. As some of you know, I spent about 2 years leading a group of physicians who reviewed the research science on the health effects of microwave RF communications. In France in 2002, asked 530 people responding to questionnaires regarding multiple symptoms that had been described as what was called at that time microwave syndrome by the Russian research. And they measured distance of the residents in meters from cell phone towers. And this is what they found. The scale here is greater than 300 meters, going down to less than 10 meters. And at closer proximities, we see more statistically significant difference from people who lived farther away from the towers. Here's irritability, headache, sleep disruption, depression, memory loss, dizziness, cardiovascular problems. Now I want to talk about consequences, chronic consequences of oxidative stress that can damage DNA. One way to look at that is to look at people that have been exposed to a lot of radio for a long time. And a study was done looking at the mortality in members of the California branch of Ham Radio Association. And someone looked at the death statistics of all these people over a period of from 1971 to 1983. And what they found was significant increases in ham radio operators of leukemias, all of them, and of various specific types of leukemias. In the Polish military, people that had higher exposures occupationally in their military jobs had increased risk of all types of cancers, gastrointestinal, brain, blood, and various types of leukemia. In a study of Navy Korean War veterans, again looking at their job in the Navy, how much RF exposure they had, if you stratify that into low, intermediate, and high radar exposure, there was higher risks of various kinds of cancer in that group. Looking at U.S. Air Force workers with occupational exposures, pilots have more exposure because they're up in front where the radios are, and they had a significant increase in the odds ratio for brain tumor. In Austria, a similar study was done looking at a tower that had been operating from 84 to 97, and they did a case control study of cancer patients living within a 1,200 meter radius of the tower. And the people that had an exposure level of 1,000 microwatts per meter squared had quite an increase in cancers, especially breast cancer and brain cancer. In Belo Horizonte, Brazil, a study was published in 2011. What they did was they found out where all those towers were. And then they used death certificates and death data in the population to find out where everyone who died of cancer in the city during that time, between 96 and 2006, lived. And then they could look and measure the distance between the person who died and the closest cell phone tower in meters. And this is the curve of that data. The closer they were, the higher the death rate from cancer was. In the last 4 or 5 years, it's become more clear how microwave RF can cause stress in cells in living tissues. And it appears the evidence really strongly supports the hypothesis that this is done by increasing oxidative stress. Microwaves increase the level of production of free radicals within living tissue in cells. Our cells have gated calcium channels that can open or shut more depending on physiology. Exposure to magnetic fields at many different levels of magnetic field frequency will open up these gates farther, and this increases the action of this enzyme producing more nitric oxide, which in turn creates peroxynitrite, which increases the production of NO2 and of the hydroxyl radical, increasing oxidative stress in tissue. So the microwave radiation doesn't break cell structures itself, but it alters our metabolism, creating more oxidative production of oxidants in the cells that creates inflammatory damage. This is an electrophoretic, a method of measuring fragmentation of DNA, where This is complete DNA, and fragments don't move through the gel as quickly and leave a trail behind them. It's called the Comet assay. And when you see a lot of fragments like this, a tail, it means that the DNA is broken and there's pieces of it that aren't the same size, so it spreads out. And you can measure that tail, and this is looking at a measurement of DNA fragmentation in rat brains that were exposed to a level of microwaves 1/3 of the FCC limits, 2 hours a day for 35 days. At the same time, they saw decrease in the amount of oxidants in the tissue of the exposed animals, a significant increase or significant decrease in molecules that are used up protecting the body against oxidation, including melatonin. And again, this is 2 hours a day for 45 days at fairly low level of exposure.
Melatonin is a hormone, and believe it or not, it's made in the brain. It's made in the pineal gland of the brain, and it's got a very powerful antioxidant status compared with vitamins. For example, melatonin is 5 times as powerful as vitamin C and twice as powerful as vitamin E. And it secretes only at night, and it's at night that we need it because that's when we go to sleep and when our brain repairs the cells of our body. And that's when melatonin comes out to do its work.
Each day, our body loses about 500 million cells. And at night, that's when our body replaces those cells through a process called cell mitosis, the dividing of cells.
And what it's doing is it's mopping up what are called free radicals. These free radicals are really the spare electrons left over from the process of making the energy which we need to repair ourselves in the first place.
Each night, as our body repairs itself, millions of free radical cells are created as a byproduct of cell mitosis. These free radical cells attack healthy cells. It is universally agreed that the free radical cell is the main causal factor in most cancer. Our body's main defense against these free radicals is its most powerful antioxidant, melatonin.
It passes into the bloodstream, and its job is to act as a natural antioxidant, a natural anti-cancer agent. Melatonin is a very, very powerful anti-cancer agent.
What it does is it acts as what's called an oncostatic agent, that is, it protects you against cancer. It controls the sleep-wake cycle. You have a reduced amount of melatonin, and what happens then is that your immune system starts to be less competent. For a start, you tend to get sleep disturbance, you can't get off to sleep, or if you do, you wake up and can't get back to sleep. You can have heart complications because melatonin protects your heart as well. The pineal gland is light sensitive. It's sitting right where your brain receives signals from your eyes, that crossover point in the middle. It's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and the connections from there goes directly to the pineal gland to tell it whether there's any light around or not. If there's light around, then there's also interference with the signals the brain wants to send to our cells in order to repair them. So it says there's no point in the brain sending these signals out to our cells to tell them to repair, because there's so much interference that they won't hear it. So it waits, the brain waits until it's dark.
Is certainly backed up by a wealth of research. able to test things like this because almost everybody has a mobile phone, almost everybody has Wi-Fi, almost everybody is exposed to electromagnetic fields.
Yes, we are reaching a situation where so many people are exposed to electromagnetic fields from mobile phones and Wi-Fi that we no longer have a control population to look at the difference between the health of people who are exposed versus the health of people who are not exposed. And if I can take an analogy, we did find out that smoking caused lung cancer. That was because some people did not smoke and they were a control group. If everyone had smoked, we may never have found that smoking caused lung cancer. And everyone would have been dying of lung cancer and it would have been regarded as a sort of natural disease without ever having a link with smoking.
6 months before I got sick, my ex-husband saw me on the cell phone all the time and he said, Daphna, maybe you want to take breaks between calls. Smiling, I said nothing. And I just thought in my head, worst case scenario, I get a brain tumor when I'm 70 or 80. Everything causes cancer. In that moment of time, I made a risk-benefit analysis. But the thing is, I made a risk-benefit analysis without actually knowing the risks.
It's pretty ugly, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's constant as well. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't stop. It's 24/7. This is what's coming out of the mast. If you can see the mast, you're being exposed to it.
Right.
Frankly, even if you can't, you're being exposed to it if you're this distance away because it'll pass through, concrete walls and things. It'll dampen it a bit, but not very much. If you're within 200-300 metres of the mast up there, this is what you're going to be exposed to 24/7.
When you can hear it, it changes everything.
It does.
Imagine if you could see it.
It'd be the equivalent of sort of, seeing a daily smog.
Yeah. So what if I try and make a call? Let me try and make a call.
If you try and make a phone call, it'll be almost constant because it starts a proper sort of two-way high bandwidth transmission.
Okay, let's do that. Oh wow.
So as soon as it picks up, this is it trying to, and this is once it's on call mode, this is now what your phone's doing.
And that's waves going from my phone to the base station and then being transmitted from there.
And that's it's picked up.
That's horrible.
And that's basically what your phone's transmitting into your head all the time that you've got it operational and you're using it for phone.
Dylan, my son, he said, Dad, you have to check these earphones that everybody's wearing, right? The wireless earphones, everyone's wearing them. And here's one of my son's good friends who I saw these in your ears all the time. Yeah. I'm sure, Vlad, you've heard us say those things are bad for you. My kids probably told you that, but you're still wearing them. Yeah. One thing we know about electromagnetic frequency is distance is the killer. Many people are using these thinking, okay, my phone is further away, but obviously it's giving a signal from your phone that's being picked up by the wireless headset. I'm 0.03. You can't see that? 0.02, which is a very safe level. As Dylan came up to me, actually, it went to 0.1, 0.3. Cellular damage starts at 0.5. That's not my opinion. That's the science. Let's connect your music to that. Connected, we're playing. Okay, you're playing. Okay, so now I'm going to bring this in to here. 1.9, 1.7, 2.3, 2.9, 3.4, 3.8, 4.6, 4. You see what's happening here. 0.5 is the damage point of DNA in cells, and yet he's far beyond that point. Right at the, look at that, 15, 17, 20. It's surging even higher right now. I mean, that's amazing numbers right there as far as when you understand what that's doing to his cells and his brain. Okay, now let's for fun, let's compare wire. Let's do the old-fashioned stuff. Okay, let's take a measure of this now. Same song. 0.03, 0.0, Dylan came close with his phone, 0.1, 0.2, still under 0.5.
This picture shows some aphids on the leaf of an orange tree shortly after radar equipment was installed at a nearby airport a number of years ago. I noticed that every few seconds, all the aphids would tense up in unison and do sort of a little dance, as you see in the picture. Upon further investigation, I found that the interval of time between the activity of each dance coincided exactly with the rotation of the radar rotor device at the airport, which was a distance of approximately 14 miles.
Despite industry's attempts to hide the truth, the science is done. There are very likely more studies that show a biological effect from electromagnetic frequencies, or EMF, than any other single area of focus in all of science. The site emfportal.org, as of late 2016, catalogs a whopping 23,800 studies. PowerWatch UK lists 1,659 studies on EMF. Of those, 1,032 found effects. A further 370 had other important insights or findings, and only 257 did not find effects.
The definition of a smart grid is a wireless system that will fundamentally turn every single appliance in your home into the equivalent of a transmitting cell phone. That's every computer, every television, every furnace, every air conditioner, every coffee machine, every printer, every single appliance that you have in your house will eventually, in a smart grid, have an antenna that's embedded into it that will transmit your usage data to a smart meter on the outside of your home that will then transmit your usage data to another tower receiving that usage signal that will then go to the utility company for supposedly billing purposes. Not all signals will just be about your individual use. There will be aggregate meters that will bounce signal from house to house to house within a neighborhood that will then accumulate all of the usage data that will transmit that to the utility company. Now, what that will do is that the end metering system that is transmitting all of that data will be firing an RF signal at many, many times a second, which will increase the average homeowner's radio frequency radiation exposure exponentially.
And then all of a sudden, one day, everybody in the news is talking about 5G. And prior to that day, we weren't really talking about it. And all of a sudden, hey, we got to be the leader in 5G. I'm like, 5G? So I'm going to start looking 5G. Okay, 1G, 2G, 3G. 1G is the regular phone back in the days. 2G is whatever. 3G is the iPhone, and then 4G is the latest phone. And then now 5G is going to be changing the game. And most people go to, well, 5G is just a faster phone, right? Because that's what initially, we've always seen the G linked to a phone. Oh my gosh, I can download a movie in 3.6 seconds now on Netflix, a 2-hour movie, where before it was 3 minutes or 6 minutes, whatever, right? When you think about 5G, what do you think about of 5G and the capabilities and what it can really do to whoever that has access to it?
That's a good question. So if you go back to 2007, when the iPhone came out.
2007.
The top 5 in market cap were AT&T, General Electric, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and Shell. Right? The phone comes out in 2007. I had one, 3G network. It's not a very good experience. 4G network comes out. Now you've got something, right? So when Steve Ballmer laughed at Steve Jobs, said, we don't need one of those. When you took the platform, which was the iPhone, and you married it up to the 4G network, which was the pipe for data, and it was a fast enough pipe, now you could create the apps, services, and business models that in 10 years led to the top 5 in market cap being Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft. Right? So the Chinese see this and they're like, the platform and the pipe. So the smartphone, this iPhone, which was the first one, then Android. So Apple and Google, right, dominate the mobile platform that the app services and business models of that economy are built on. Now look at the iPhone. It's a hardware, software, tightly integrated, closed-walled system like Steve Jobs liked, and the data was encrypted. Why was the data encrypted? Why did San Bernardino happen? Because Apple's an American company, right? They know you want privacy. They encrypt their phone. So now you've got the platform, and Android also went on to encrypt their platform. So both encrypted, right? So private devices. Take the cloud away from it. Just look at the device itself.
Sure.
It's meant to be a private device.
Right.
Why? It's American product. Fast forward, to 2009, China starts to look at that, says, okay, we want to dominate the next level, right? Not just the technology, we want the apps, services, and business models to be Chinese companies. And so Huawei gets hundreds of billions of dollars to develop 5G and ZTE. But then you have Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So they're behind the Chinese firewall. They're protected. You can't have the fangs going in there. It's just the bats that control the e-economy within China. And then you start, at the same time you're developing 5G, right, the platform, and I'll get to that in a second, but you're also developing Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So now when you walk into, and you're starting to see the emergence of the 5G world in China. So you walk into a restaurant after you've ordered your food, and a camera picks you up, and you say, hey, David, welcome, here's your food, right? So you're starting to get the feel of what a 5G world is. And what is a 5G world? The platform is the network. So this is mobile computing paired with a pipe. 5G is computing and networking combined on the same platform. So this goes away. You walk outside your door and you say Uber. You don't get on your phone and say, I want an Uber. You just say Uber. Camera picks up your face or a microphone picks up you.
Come on.
That's what 5G is. That's what 5G is. And then the Uber shows up. There's a camera on the car that sees you, knows who you are, don't have to ask you your name. You get in and you go to wherever you want. You get out and you go do whatever you want. So in this world, in the 4G world, this is a platform. It's yours, right? You don't want to be part of that, all of that data. Remember we just talked about how do you influence society? You don't want all that data to be out there about what you're doing. Just don't carry one of these, right? Just opt out. In a 5G world, you cannot opt out. Who owns the data? This, you could conceivably say, you lease the data on here you own. If you're getting Google services, you don't own that data. But in the 5G world, not only can you not opt out because it's built around the city, it's not in your phone anymore. Not only can you not opt out, you don't know who owns the data. Everything that you do can be watched.
They have 1 billion right now on surveillance.
Right,
1 billion cameras in China right now.
With artificial intelligence for facial recognition, right? So all of this is getting built right now in China. And who's helping them do it? Microsoft, Google, right? All of these companies that want to deploy this world into our country.
I'll just dive right in if that's okay. Yeah, I've got a screen here from Verizon. This is actually lifted off a website called Environmental Health Trust, who posted this. They went into the investment information for Verizon and saw what Verizon is telling their investors about what to expect. And I quote, our wireless business also faces personal injury and consumer class action lawsuits relating to alleged health effects of wireless phones or radio frequency transmitters. Class action lawsuits that challenge marketing practices are possible, and disclosures relating to alleged adverse health effects of handheld wireless phones are possible. We may incur significant expenses in defending these lawsuits. They're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars to make your videos load faster. If you look at the investment that it takes to do what they plan to do, literally cells covering the entire nation every 900 feet. The investment to do that is so vast that they're going to have to come up with all kinds of ways of recovering that. There is really only one industry that gives the promise of recouping that money, and that's mass surveillance. You know, they're trying to come up with, how do we make this sound like there's a benefit to the user? It's very trumped up. It's very contrived. What they're doing is mass surveillance. It's Internet of Things, IoT, and that Internet of Things is connected to everything you touch and feel and use. And that collects extremely high resolution data on what you do every day. And that data is to be exploited. If they don't find a way to penalize you or tax you or somehow extract wealth from you with that data, they will never get anywhere near close to paying for this infrastructure. So they're coming for you. With 5G, the Internet of Things is planned to collect data from 20 billion cameras, microphones, sensors, and loggers to central databases. That's the 5G system, 20 billion input devices. That's more than 60 monitoring devices for every single American. The term EMF stands for electromagnetic frequencies, and the term EMR, electromagnetic radiation, they mean the same thing, includes not one but three main categories of harmful biological exposures: radio frequencies, electric fields, and magnetic fields. And all of these things are in our environments in large amounts. So radio frequencies is anything wireless. Electric fields is wiring errors in your house. Your wiring starts to broadcast and emanate electric fields. It's called transients, is the electrician's term for that, but we call it dirty electricity. I spoke to a woman who called me. I get a lot of calls from people who are just, I'm sick, I don't know why, or I think this is EMF, how can I shield this? I get calls all day. And this woman said when she was a child, maybe 7 years old, they put her in a bed by a wall, and right on the other side of the wall was a big refrigerator motor. And she slept in that bed through her teens, so probably 10 years plus, and she became hopelessly electromagnetic sensitive. She can't walk up to a computer. She can't use an electric device. She is seriously disabled and handicapped. And the only reason, one and only reason, was that they had her sleeping 2 feet from a large motor as she grew up and as she developed. For a long time, we were helping people with utility meters by literally selling them an electromechanical meter. That's the analog one, the old one your grandma had. We sell it to them, and we give them a notice, a legal notice to send to their utility company. You are trespassing with harmful radiation, surveillance, fire hazard, dirty electricity. I could explain all that. It's a horrible thing, these electronic utility meters. And since you're trespassing with those, you have to have it off our property within 30 days, or we will put a safe and lawful meter on there, and you have no recourse. And that worked for a couple of years. And that actually bought people a year or two of time without the new meters. And the power companies say, okay, we'll get back to you later. Well, now it's later. And now they're shutting people off. So we found out that if you threaten them in that way, they'll say, well, okay, we'll just shut off your electricity. And now they're no more Mr. Nice Guy. They're playing hardball. They just shut you off. I spoke to someone the other day who was, that going through this with their power company. It was, they had, had to move their utility meter and do all kinds of things and install line conditioners and do all this stuff. But the power company said, okay, you can have the opt-out meter. Now, this is total fraud. What you want to opt out is radiation, surveillance, fire hazard, dirty electricity. Your utility meter causes dirty electricity because it has a switching mode power supply in it, the little device that steals electricity to power the surveillance device in the utility meter. That disrupts your incoming current and completely sends dirty electricity all over the house. Okay, you've got to opt out of that. Well, they don't opt out of that. They opt out of the radio frequencies. That utility meter has no surge protector. If you put a surge protector in an electronic utility meter, it's useless because the surveillance device, the flammable electronics, are right there in the circuit. There's no way to protect it. So they just threw the surge protector out. You've got a fire hazard on your house. You've got to opt out of that. They don't offer an opt-out for that. So this opt-out, we'll take the radio transmitter out. Okay, pay us $90 up front and $15 a month for your opt-out meter. That solves one of 4 problems.
But another, even more neglected aspect of the 5G dark reality is that in a world where all objects are wired and constantly communicating data to one another through a 5G network, an Internet of Things, in other words, privacy and security would be next to impossible. Even the mainstream is now admitting that the unprecedented amounts of data flowing through the 5G network, from appliance usage to personal communications to transaction information, is a treasure trove that, if it were to fall into the wrong hands, would be a formidable weapon.
Huawei wants to become a major player in 5G outside of China, but it's facing pressure internationally because of cybersecurity concerns dogging the company. The US is urging its allies to block Huawei from 5G projects in their countries.
Maron says China is using mobile technology as a tool for spying, and he's seen the evidence.
They are actually using it for massive surveillance against their own population. We looked on the Huawei equipment to the level of every single chip there, and what we found is not very pleasant. This is not a commercial company stuff. This is a kind of nearly a military-grade stuff.
As some are only now starting to realize, the price that one pays for this world of robotic comfort and convenience is control. Control over our data, control over our security, and control over our lives.
We just hooked up the Nest maybe a month ago.
Abby Laguidao and Conrado Casalo wanted something to keep their family safe, so they installed Nest, a smart home security camera system.
What drives me crazy is yesterday was the only day I decided to stay home. He's always here. They never said anything, ever.
Yesterday, Abby was alone with her 2 kids when she started hearing voices coming from their Nest.
Then they started cussing and saying, "Shut the F up, you N-word."
At that point, Abby had figured out that someone had hacked into their security system. Shut the f up. She called her partner, Conrado.
Somebody is in the Nest and is watching us and is talking to us right now.
I think within 5 years, most people will have at least...
That is something out of a horror movie right there.
Man, can you imagine it?
Like we knew something was going to go on? That scared...
That
scared the tar out of me.
That was a real jump.
And we're going to go ahead and unlock the door, her back door.
Oh.
I think that was your lock.
That was our lock.
Let's go look, come on.
And that isn't any laughing matter.
See, but that's the real fear, right?
That...
You know, the other stuff's kind of funny, whatever, but I mean, someone can unlock your house.
Although, if someone really wants to get into your house, you can pick a lock.
Yeah, but isn't that the modern day... There it goes again. I mean, isn't that the modern day lockpick? There's a guy outside with a laptop who's opening and closing your door lock.
It is, and I don't like it.
After their stunt on the highway, Chris and Charlie still wanted to show me a couple of other tricks. Below a certain speed, they can control the Jeep's steering as long as it's in reverse, pop its locks, mess with the speedometer, and, of course, disable the brakes. Okay, hold on tight. Hold on.
Oh, he's not getting out of that. I don't think so. We're going to be doing some pushing.
But now that the 5G network is promising to deliver us not an internet of phones and computers, but an internet of things, from cars and watches to fridges and hats to milk jugs and floor tiles. When every manufactured object is broadcasting information about you and your activities to the world at large by default, and when it is discovered that opting out of this surveillance grid is not an option, the true nature of the 5G panopticon will finally begin to dawn on the public. But by that point, it will already be too late.
Cities use data every day. Everything from showing you when your next train will arrive to measuring the air quality in different neighborhoods. Typically, all this information is spread out across a ton of different agencies and companies in a bunch of different file formats and spreadsheets. But at Keysight, we have the chance to start from scratch and build a single, unified digital platform that's transparent, open, and accessible for everyone working to make our cities better.
The leaders behind Toronto's first data-driven smart city are under fire tonight after yet another resignation. This time, a member of Waterfront Toronto's digital advisory panel quit and wrote a strongly worded letter on her way out, sharing her deep concerns about privacy and data control.
I want to get some feedback now from the former Information and Privacy Commissioner from the province of Ontario, who, when last you were here discussing this very topic, you were kind of bullish about it. And then I just couldn't but help notice that you've resigned from your involvement in all this. What happened?
And I didn't do it lightly. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that we had to make sure that all the personal data that was being collected automatically by the sensors and other technologies were de-identified at source, anonymized at source.
De-identified meaning?
Meaning no personal identifiers. You wouldn't know it's Ann Kavukian walking or you or this is my car or anything. And the reason that was critical is unlike most uses of what I call operational data, where the individual, the data subject, can exercise some control over the use, the operation of that data. They can consent to it, they can revoke consent, they can choose not to consent. They have some sense of control. With the data here, you have no control. It's all being collected automatically with the emerging technology, sensors, all picking up data.
As unimaginable as a real-time database keeping track of every transaction and every manufactured product in the economy was in the 1930s, that is exactly the world we are looking at as smart meters collect information on smart appliances connected to other smart objects through the Internet of Things. And, crucially, the sheer amount of data being generated in this smart grid and the constant real-time communication required to keep the system functioning would be impossible without the 5G network. 5G is not just a neutral mobile network. It is the backbone for a system of total surveillance which has been written about and worked toward for the better part of a century. The world of the technocrats, the world of the smart grid, and the world of constant real-time surveillance of everything would not be possible without the 5G network that is being installed right now.
Do they have the right to refuse the new meter?
The meters are a necessary upgrade to the electricity grid.
Okay, but this is non-negotiable. You must have the new meter?
They are a necessary upgrade to the electricity grid.
Okay, I'll try this one more time. Legally, are you allowed to refuse the new meter? You're uncomfortable with this question.
I'm just trying to figure out how best to answer that.
Our NATO allies are here today participating and observing the active denial system technology. The active denial system is a millimeter wave radio frequency that creates what can only be described as a very uncomfortable, almost intolerable heating sensation on the surface of your skin. I've been exposed 5 or 6 times now, and when you're in the beam of the active denial system, you can't stay there for very long. You're gonna be compelled to pick up and move out.
And another noteworthy parameter is the target's skin reflectivity. Laboratory studies have determined that the distribution of human skin reflectivity at the ADT frequencies. And so ADT system developers can use these experimental data to design systems that achieve the desired effectiveness despite the natural variation in skin reflectivity.
The government limits are 26 years old. The current standards for every one of the world's 8 billion phones and many more devices are 26 years old. And the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals was so appalled by that, that when our organization sued and asked for an update of the standards, the court ruled that we had established the failure of the FCC to provide a record of reasoned decision-making. An agency is free to look at the record and disagree with what's submitted, but they have to give reason. And the court ordered that the FCC had got to address the impacts of radiation in children. The court also held that there was a failure to consider any of the evidence on environmental effects. These studies that I'm showing you here had modeled how much more radiation exposure there would be if 5G existed at the current permitted levels. So you see on the left of the image in front of you what you have currently simulated for Austin, Texas. And then on the right, you see what would be permitted with 5G.
Many governments, France, United Kingdom, Spain, Austria, Switzerland, and so forth, several countries, they measure radio frequency radiation. They have public websites where you can go online, pick your location, and see what the radio frequency levels are. You can even, if you live in France, you go to your mayor and you say, I'd like to know what the radiation is right outside my door. And actually, they put in a request, measurements are done, and you're given that information. So there's a lot of transparency. France also has a 5G monitoring station, several places across Paris. It's really interesting if you're interested in this subject to go online and see that. There's also many bans and restrictions on Wi-Fi in schools, bans in kindergarten and nursery schools. Belgium, as well as many private schools, are doing this across the world. In France, in Israel, Cyprus, which also has a directive taking Wi-Fi out of elementary schools, and French Polynesia as well.
You've got no justification whatsoever for the thousands of watts that are being radiated from the average 4G tower these days. Tens of thousands of watts, actually, for most of them. It's crazy. There's no engineering justification, and there's certainly no health justification. So I started off by reminding them that as engineers, they should know that. Now, how do I know they're engineers? Because anything they said about biology was ridiculous. and that it was quite clear that physicians had not been involved in drafting the regulations.
If you look at number one, with 5 bars on the cell phone, and then you look over here to how much microwatts per square meter it is, it's actually very, very low. You're used to these guidelines being somewhere between 1 and 10 might be okay, but 0.002 microwatts per square meter will give you 5 bars on a cell phone. And then what this does is it takes all of the things from the RF bar charts and these studies, which are close to 4,000 or 5,000 of them, that are part of the Bioinitiative report, and it just lists out for you on this page exactly what's happening at each of these levels. And the crazy thing is how much higher the guideline is versus what we need.
If you have a look at line 2 and line 3, 5 bars on a cell phone, and then at line 3 is 15,000 times higher than that, is where sleep disorders, weakness, fatigue, and pain in a group of teenagers was found.
So let's take a look at 1,000, 2,000, 2,500. I see a lot of homes that have this right now. And what's happening? This is childhood leukemia, impaired motor function, memory, attention, altered white blood cells. This affects your immunity. So all of this is just disastrous. And it's happening well below the guideline, which is up there around 5 billion times higher than 5 bars on a cell phone. Think about it this way. I have to be a good neighbor to my neighbor. I have to, I can only have a Wi-Fi router with just a certain amount of power. I can't have more than that. All right. Well, if I'm 25 to 50 feet from my neighbor and that pole is 25 to 50 feet from me, well, that pole should be the same kind of neighbor as I am to my neighbor. So let's cap that pole at 0.1 watt. Look, here's a 4-inch antenna. That's the size of it. It's all you need to actually get it done in your neighborhood. You get a small cell, something that size, you're good to go. You'll have service. This is built to scale. This is a model. This is a 4-foot antenna, Amphenol. It's very, very popular. This is how thick it is. This is how big it is. And that is a macro tower antenna. Do not lie to yourself. That is a macro tower. There is no such thing as a small cell. You have to think about it as the amount of power getting into my bedroom. And when you do, you're going to realize the power is 10 million times higher than what you would get from a macro tower 3,000 feet away. Imagine I have, my job is to send you data. Okay, your cell phone, you just showed up and you talk to me, the tower, say, hey, I'm over here, I want something. I go, oh, okay, you're over there? Got it. What's my first job? I got to build a road. Okay, and so I'm going to say, hey, I'm here, I'm about to build your road. Boom, there's a chunk of data or chunk of energy. And then, okay, we got a connection. That's reliable. I got it. What do you want now? Then you come back and say, I want a piece of text. And then I go, all right, I don't have to build you a goat path for that. Here's your little piece of text. We're done. Thank you. Oh no, but what if you said, I want a video? Oh man, now I got to do a lot more building. What am I going to build? A 2-lane highway? Well, maybe a 2-lane highway will get you a phone call, but probably it's a 3-lane highway for a phone call. Oh, you need some web pages? Yeah, no, that's a 6-lane highway in both directions, kind of like an Autobahn. Okay, so what did you want? You wanted a 4K video streamed to you? Excuse me, while I build 15 Autobahns and push down to you 85 aircraft carriers. That's what's happening when you ask for a video.
Here, we don't actually have any entity that is in charge of cell tower emissions, for example. We have the FCC, but they're not a health and safety agency. So there is no agency with health expertise or environmental expertise that's doing the research, reviewing it, making sure that new 5G networks are safe or any of that. It's actually a complete regulatory gap. How do phones work? I mean, have we even ever stopped to think about that? I thought it was like, I guess like magic. I never thought about it before. And then I thought, well, surely the government would never let anything be sold that could be harmful.
Even the birds don't like the 5G. They're pulling it apart. That one over there. Jesus. They don't like it, mate. tell you, they're not dumb, the birds. They know what's happening. Good on them, mate. Yeah. God, they're going for it, aren't they? They're like, fuck the 5G.